Upon meeting the new governess, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw her necklace identical to the one his daughter wore when she disappeared. In the sprawling mansion of Armando Velasco, shadows dance across ornate hallways, each echo a painful reminder of the laughter that had once filled them. Armando, once a vibrant and powerful businessman, now lived in solitude. His days were consumed by hollow routines, his nights haunted by the memory of his daughter, Sofia, who had disappeared without a trace a decade ago. Her absence was a wound that never healed, a scar etched deeply into his soul. On a cold morning, a sharp knock at the mansion's grand doors signaled the arrival of Elena Montero, the new governanta. Armando, seated in his study, barely looked up when the housekeeper announced her presence. Yet when Elena entered, her presence seemed to carry an inexplicable weight, as if the very air had thickened. She was young, with a quiet grace, her eyes deep pools of mystery that held 1,000 unspoken stories. But what caught Armando's attention, what froze him in place, was the delicate pendant that rested against her chest. The room seemed to shrink as his gaze locked on the necklace. It was a silver locket, simple but distinctive, identical to the one Sofia had worn the day she vanished. His breath hitched, memories flooding back with the force of a tidal wave. He could hear Sofia's laughter, feel her tiny arms around his neck, see her joyful face as she proudly showed him the locket he had given her on her 5th birthday. The sight of it now, worn by a stranger, was like a dagger twisting in his chest. Elena noticed his reaction, her hand instinctively brushing the pendant. "Señor Velasco," she said, her voice soft but steady, "is everything all right?" Her question lingered in the air, but Armando couldn't find the words to respond. Recovering from his shock, he forced himself to compose his features. "The necklace," he said, his voice low and almost trembling. "Where did you get it?" Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "It belonged to my mother," she said simply. "She told me it was a family heirloom." "Why do you ask?" Armando's heart raced. A family heirloom? Could it be a coincidence, or was this the thread he had been waiting to unravel for 10 agonizing years? He leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. "No reason," he lied, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. The conversation ended as quickly as it had started, but Armando's mind was ablaze. He watched her leave the study, her footsteps soft against the polished wooden floors. The necklace gleamed faintly in the dim light, its presence a cruel reminder of the past. That evening, Armando paced the halls of the mansion, unable to shake the image of the necklace from his mind. He pulled out a photograph of Sofia, the locket clearly visible around her neck, and compared it to the one Elena wore. Every detail was identical. His hands trembled as he clutched the photo, a mixture of hope and dread tightening his chest. Meanwhile, Elena settled into her new role with quiet efficiency. The other staff members whispered about her, intrigued by her mysterious aura and impressed by her work ethic. She was polite but distant, as if guarding a secret too painful to share. Dolores, the former governanta who had worked for Armando for decades, watched Elena with wary eyes. She sensed something unusual about the girl, though she couldn't quite place what it was. Late one evening, Dolores approached Armando. "Señor," she said, her voice tinged with concern, "there's something about that girl. She seems familiar, no?" Armando's gaze darkened. "She wears Sofia's locket," he said, his voice a low growl. Dolores gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "Nothing is impossible," Armando replied. His tone was resolute now, a man who had lived too long in the shadow of doubt. "I need to know who she really is." As the night deepened, the mansion seemed alive with secrets. Armando resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as he watched Elena from the shadows, a quiet unease settled over him. Who was this woman? And why did she carry a piece of his past as if it had always been hers? The Velasco mansion had always carried an air of somber elegance, but in the days following Elena's arrival, the atmosphere grew heavier. as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Armando Velasco, restless and consumed by thoughts of the mysterious necklace, spent hours in his study poring over old photos and documents related to his daughter's disappearance. He hadn't touched those files in years, but now, every detail seemed to demand re-examination. As he flipped through a worn police report, his mind replayed the day Sofia vanished. The garden party had been bustling with laughter, music, and the chatter of guests. Sofia had been playing hide-and-seek among the hedges, her silver locket glinting in the sunlight. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The memory was a torment that had never dulled, but now, for the first time in a decade, a faint glimmer of hope, or perhaps desperation, stirred within him. Meanwhile, Elena's days were spent dutifully managing the household. She worked with quiet precision, her presence unassuming yet oddly magnetic. The other staff members found themselves drawn to her, but Dolores remained wary. The older woman, with her sharp intuition, couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's arrival was no coincidence. She began watching the young woman closely, her shrewd eyes picking up on small details, the way Elena seemed to navigate the mansion with an uncanny familiarity, or how she occasionally paused in front of Sofia's old bedroom, her expression unreadable. One evening, as the household settled into its usual routines, Armando approached Dolores in the dimly lit kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his expression heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Dolores," he began, his voice low, "have you noticed anything unusual about her?" Dolores nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Señor, she's careful, but there's something about the way she carries herself. As if she belongs here, but doesn't want anyone to know it." Armando's jaw tightened. "I can't ignore the necklace. It's identical, Dolores. I need to know where it truly came from." Dolores hesitated before replying. "If you want answers, Señor, you'll need to confront her. But be careful. Sometimes the truth isn't what we expect, and it can hurt more than the lies." That night, Armando decided to take action. While Elena was tending to the library, meticulously organizing its countless volumes, he entered the room. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and dust. Elena looked up as he approached, her hands pausing mid-motion. "Señor Velasco," she greeted him, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Is there something you need?" Armando's gaze bore into hers, unyielding. "I need to know more about your past," he said bluntly. Elena blinked, her composure faltering for the first time. "My past," she echoed. "Yes," he replied, stepping closer. "Your family, your upbringing. And that necklace, where exactly did it come from?" She instinctively reached for the locket, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. "I've told you, it belonged to my mother," she said, her tone defensive but not unkind. "She gave it to me before she passed away. It's the only thing I have left of her." Armando studied her carefully, searching for signs of deceit, but her expression was earnest, her eyes wide with sincerity. Still, his doubts gnawed at him. "Do you know anything about where she got it?" he pressed. Elena shook her head. "No. She never spoke much about her past. I always assumed it was just something she cherished." Her answer, though plausible, did little to quell Armando's unease. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "That locket, it's not just any necklace. It belonged to my daughter." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his words hanging between them. Elena's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked as if she might say something, but then she turned away, her face clouded with an emotion Armando couldn't place. "I don't know what to tell you, Señor Velasco," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't explain it." Later that night, as Elena lay in her modest quarters, she stared at the locket resting in her palm. The cool metal felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the burden of secrets she didn't fully understand. Memories of her own childhood flickered in her mind, fragmented and elusive, like shadows on the edge of her consciousness. She had always sensed that there were pieces missing, parts of her story that didn't quite fit. Meanwhile, in his study, Armando poured himself a glass of brandy, his thoughts a tumultuous storm. He resolved to dig deeper into Elena's past, even if it meant uncovering truths that might shatter the fragile hope he dared to feel. Unbeknownst to them both, the mansion held more secrets than either could imagine, and the necklace was just the beginning. The nights in the Velasco mansion were long and oppressive, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floors or the distant rustle of leaves against the windows. But tonight was different. The air carried an undeniable tension, as if the house itself anticipated a storm brewing within its walls. Armando Velasco, seated in his study, stared at the flickering flames in the fireplace. His hands clutched a photograph of Sofia, the silver locket around her small neck gleaming in the sunlight of a long-lost day. His mind raced with questions he couldn't yet answer, each one sharpening his determination to uncover the truth. Dolores entered quietly, her footsteps soft against the Persian rug. She carried a small, weathered box, its surface scarred by time. Placing it on the desk, she stepped back, her expression grave. "Senor," she began, her voice low but firm, "this was found among Sofia's belongings after she disappeared. I thought it might help." Armando opened the box with trembling hands, revealing a collection of Sofia's keepsakes, a tiny bracelet, a lock of her baby hair tied with a pink ribbon, and a folded note in her childish handwriting. But beneath these mementos lay something unexpected, an old receipt from a jewelry shop in the city, dated just weeks before her disappearance. It bore a name he hadn't seen in years, Arturo Ortega. The name struck him like a thunderbolt. Arturo had been the family's trusted jeweler, a man known for his discretion and skill. If anyone could explain the origins of Elena's necklace, it was him. But Arturo had vanished shortly after Sofia's disappearance, his shop shuttered and his name whispered in hushed tones among the city's elite. Armando's resolve hardened. He would find Arturo, no matter what it took. Turning to Dolores, he instructed her to arrange a meeting with an investigator he trusted, a man capable of finding even the most elusive of ghosts. Meanwhile, Elena wandered the halls, her thoughts a tangled web of confusion and unease. She had avoided Armando since their tense conversation in the library, but the weight of his words lingered in her mind. The idea that her locket might belong to his missing daughter seemed impossible, yet something about it gnawed at her. She found herself drawn to Sofia's old bedroom, its door slightly ajar as if inviting her inside. The room was untouched, a frozen snapshot of a life interrupted. A canopy bed draped in pastel linens, shelves filled with dolls and books, and a music box sitting on the vanity, its lid slightly open. Elena hesitated before stepping inside, her fingertips brushing against the faded wallpaper. She felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity, as if she had been here before, though she knew it couldn't be true. Her gaze fell on the music box, and before she realized it, her hands were turning the tiny brass key. The melody that spilled forth was hauntingly beautiful, each note resonating deep within her. Memories surfaced, fleeting and indistinct, like shadows dancing at the edge of her consciousness. A child's laughter, the soft hum of a lullaby, the scent of roses. She stumbled back, clutching the locket against her chest as tears welled in her eyes. Downstairs, Dolores found Elena in the kitchen later that night, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Elena, are you all right?" Dolores asked, concern etched into her features. Elena hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I'm not," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something doesn't feel right. It's like pieces of my life don't fit together. And this house, Dolores, there's something about it that feels familiar." Dolores stiffened but said nothing, her mind racing. She had always been skeptical of coincidences, and Elena's presence was beginning to feel less and less like one. The next morning, Armando's investigator, Luis, arrived with news that sent chills down his spine. Arturo Ortega was alive but living in hiding, his location known only to a select few. Luis had managed to track him down to a small, secluded village outside the city. "He's afraid, Senor Velasco," Luis explained. But he agreed to meet you, on one condition. He wants to speak alone. Armando wasted no time. He prepared for the journey, leaving Dolores in charge of the mansion. Before he left, he found Elena in the garden, tending to the roses. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. "I'm leaving for a few days," he said, his tone curt. "When I return, we will talk again. Until then, I suggest you think carefully about your past." Elena's heart sank at his words, but she nodded, her gaze dropping to the locket. As Armando departed, a storm began to gather on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in as if mirroring the turmoil within the Velasco mansion. Hours later, Armando arrived in the remote village, its streets quiet and shrouded in mist. Arturo's hideout was a modest cabin at the edge of a dense forest. The old jeweler greeted him with wary eyes, his face lined with age and fear. "Señor Velasco," Arturo began, his voice trembling. "I knew this day would come. But I must warn you, the truth you seek may not bring you peace." Armando stepped closer, his gaze unrelenting. "I don't need peace, Arturo. I need answers. Start with the necklace." Arturo sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a decade-long secret. "The locket. I made 2 of them," he confessed. "The first was for Sofia, as you know. The second was commissioned by someone else. A woman. She said it was for her daughter, but she wouldn't give me her name." Armando's blood ran cold. "Who was she, Arturo? What did she look like?" Arturo hesitated before responding. "She had dark hair, piercing eyes, and she wore a red scarf. That's all I remember. But, Señor Velasco, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, a man I recognized. One of your staff." The revelation hit Armando like a thunderclap, leaving him stunned and seething with fury. Someone within his own home had betrayed him, had stolen his daughter and replaced her with a decade of anguish. As Arturo's words sank in, the storm outside unleashed its fury, rain lashing against the cabin windows. Armando's fists clenched, his mind racing with the implications. He had uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle, but the picture it painted was more horrifying than he had ever imagined. And back at the mansion, Dolores found an old photograph tucked away in the attic, a photograph of Sofia as a baby, held by a woman with dark hair and piercing eyes. A red scarf draped around her shoulders. The rain continued to pound mercilessly against the cabin's windows as Armando stood frozen, Arturo's words reverberating in his mind. Someone within his home had orchestrated Sofia's disappearance, a betrayal so vile it threatened to consume him. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms, but the pain did nothing to quell the storm raging within. "Who was it, Arturo?" Armando demanded, his voice cold and sharp as steel. The old jeweler hesitated, his hands trembling. "I can't say for certain," he stammered, his eyes darting away from Armando's piercing gaze. "But I remember, the man always wore a black jacket with a crest on the sleeve. A crest with the Velasco family emblem." Armando's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Only a select few within his household had been granted such jackets, a privilege reserved for those he trusted most. A deep sense of dread settled over him as he recalled the faces of his staff from a decade ago. One name, one face, emerged from the fog of his memories: Enrique. Enrique had been a loyal servant, or so Armando had believed. He had left the mansion abruptly after Sofia's disappearance, claiming the grief was too much to bear. At the time, Armando had accepted the excuse, too consumed by his own despair to question it. Now, that trust felt like a blade twisting in his chest. Without another word, Armando turned and stormed out into the rain, his coat doing little to shield him from the downpour. Arturo called after him, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of thunder. Armando's mind was set. He would find Enrique and extract the truth, no matter what it took. Back at the mansion, the storm cast an eerie glow over the sprawling estate. Dolores stood in the attic, the photograph she had discovered trembling in her hands. The image was faded, but the details were unmistakable: a woman with dark hair and piercing eyes holding baby Sophia, a red scarf draped around her shoulders. Dolores felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's face was hauntingly familiar, but she couldn't place where she had seen her before. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft creak of the floorboards behind her. She spun around, clutching the photograph to her chest. "Elena," Dolores gasped, her voice filled with surprise. Elena stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I heard footsteps," she said softly, her eyes flickering to the photograph in Dolores's hands. "What is that?" Dolores hesitated, unsure whether to reveal the discovery. But something in Elena's gaze compelled her to step forward and show the photo. As Elena's eyes fell on the image, her breath hitched. She reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the outline of the woman's face. I know her," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. Dolores's heart raced. "What do you mean, you know her?" Elena shook her head, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't know how, but I've seen her before. In dreams, maybe, or memories. She feels familiar, like a shadow I've been chasing my whole life." Before Dolores could press further, a sudden knock echoed through the mansion, loud and insistent. Both women froze, their eyes locking in shared apprehension. Downstairs, the heavy front door swung open to reveal Armando, drenched from the storm and seething with fury. His eyes burned with a dangerous intensity as he stepped inside, his presence commanding and unrelenting. Dolores and Elena hurried down the grand staircase to meet him, their expressions a mixture of concern and fear. "Señor Velasco," Dolores began, but Armando cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Where is Enrique?" he demanded, his voice like thunder. Dolores blinked, taken aback. "Enrique? Señor, he left years ago." Armando's gaze shifted to Elena, his suspicion palpable. "Do you know anything about this?" Elena shook her head, her confusion evident. "No, I don't even know who Enrique is." For a moment, silence reigned, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Armando spoke, his tone icy and resolute. "He was here when Sophia disappeared. And now I know he wasn't just a servant, he was part of something much darker. I need to find him." Dolores stepped forward hesitantly. "Señor, we've been searching for answers for years. If Enrique is involved, do you really think he'll still be within reach?" Armando's jaw tightened. "He's out there, and I will find him. But first, I need to understand this." He turned to Dolores, his eyes narrowing. "That photograph, let me see it." Dolores hesitated but handed him the picture. Armando's expression darkened as he studied the image. "The woman," he muttered, his voice low. "I've seen her before. She wasn't just anyone, she was connected to someone close to us. Someone who betrayed us." The storm outside raged on as Armando retreated to his study, the photograph clenched in his hand. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than he could have imagined. And in the shadows of the mansion, unseen eyes watched with silent intent. The game had only just begun. The storm outside had reached a deafening crescendo, lightning illuminating the sprawling Velasco mansion in flashes of stark brilliance. Inside, the air was suffused with an almost unbearable tension, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind magnified by the weight of the secrets that were about to surface. In the study, Armando sat at his desk, the photograph of the mysterious woman with the red scarf laid out before him. His thoughts were a whirlwind, every revelation tightening the noose of betrayal around his family's legacy. The room was dimly lit, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls, as if the mansion itself were alive and watching. Elena stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. She had followed him from the foyer, compelled by a force she couldn't name. For days, her unease had grown, each interaction with Armando pulling at threads buried deep in her subconscious. The photograph had been the final tug, bringing a rush of emotions she couldn't ignore. "Señor Velasco," she said softly, her voice trembling but determined. Armando looked up, his eyes shadowed with weariness and suspicion. "Elena," he replied, his tone unreadable. "Do you have something to tell me?" She stepped inside, her movements hesitant but deliberate. "I don't know what's happening," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I feel connected to all of this. To you. To this house. To her." She pointed to the photograph, her fingers trembling. "I don't understand why, but I think I know that woman." Armando's eyes narrowed, his suspicion deepening. "And why would you know her, Elena?" "Unless," he stopped, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a blade poised to strike. Before either could say more, Dolores appeared in the doorway, her expression stricken. "Señor," she said urgently, "I've found something else." She held a small leather journal, its cover worn and faded. It was hidden in the attic, tucked inside an old trunk. She placed it on the desk, her hands lingering for a moment before pulling away as if the book carried a curse. Armando opened it cautiously, the pages brittle with age. Inside were detailed notes, written in a sharp, precise hand. Dates, names, and cryptic symbols filled the pages. But it was the final entry that made his breath catch. "Deliver the child to the convent. The locket will keep her safe. She must never know the truth." Armando's heart raced as he read the words aloud. He looked up at Dolores, then at Elena, whose face had gone pale. "A convent," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's where I grew up." Dolores gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It can't be." Armando stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "It's not a coincidence," he declared, his voice filled with a mix of anguish and determination. "Elena, you were sent to that convent for a reason. And now we know why." Before they could process the revelation, the sound of a car engine broke through the storm's roar. Armando's head snapped toward the window, his sharp instincts telling him this was no ordinary visitor. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. He grabbed the revolver he kept locked in the desk drawer and moved toward the door, his footsteps purposeful. Elena and Dolores exchanged a worried glance before following at a cautious distance. Outside, a sleek black car was parked in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the rain. A figure emerged, cloaked in darkness and carrying an umbrella. As the figure approached, the light from the mansion revealed a familiar face. "Enrique." Armando stepped forward, his revolver raised. "You have a lot to answer for," he growled, his voice like thunder. Enrique held up his hands, his expression calm but calculating. "Señor Velasco," he began, his tone smooth. "I came here to talk. To tell you the truth." "Truth?" Armando spat, his finger tightening on the trigger. "After all these years? After you stole my daughter?" Enrique's eyes flickered to Elena, standing just behind Armando. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "It seems the truth has already started to reveal itself." "Speak," Armando demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Enrique sighed, his facade cracking. "I was following orders," he admitted. "The woman in the photograph, her name was Beatrice. She was your wife's sister." Armando's blood ran cold. "My wife's sister," he repeated, disbelief etched into every word. "She resented you," Enrique continued. "She believed you had taken everything from her, her family's fortune, her sister's love. When Sofia was born, she saw an opportunity to hurt you in the deepest way possible. She paid me to take Sofia and deliver her to the convent, ensuring she would grow up far away from you." The weight of Enrique's confession crashed down on Armando, leaving him momentarily speechless. He turned to Elena, who stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "I don't remember any of it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But it's true, isn't it? I'm Sofia." Armando's revolver lowered, his hand trembling. He stepped toward her, his heart breaking at the sight of her pain. "You are Sofia," he said, his voice soft but certain. "And I will never lose you again." Enrique watched silently, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smirk, he spoke once more. "Beatrice didn't just want to take Sofia. She wanted to destroy you completely. And she's not done." Before anyone could react, Enrique turned and disappeared into the storm, his parting words leaving a chilling silence in their wake. Armando pulled Elena into an embrace, the truth binding them together even as new dangers loomed. The mansion, once a place of shadows, now held the flicker of hope, but the darkness was far from gone.